the deadliest betrayal doesn't arrive with a hurricane's roar, but with the calm smile of suits making you the scapegoat for a $50 million disaster. At 36, scarred by divorce, they assumed I was disposable. They calculated everything perfectly except for one fatal flaw. Never corner a woman with nothing left to lose, especially when she has a Marine major watching her back. This is how I burned their corporate empire to ashes. Hello and welcome back to Haley Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for being here, but unfortunately YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1, so our team can pay their living expenses and continue creating these narratives for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link down in the description or the comment section. My name is Natalia Gonzalez, and I was 36 years old when the ocean tried to claim my life. I worked as a senior field inspector for Global Maritime Vanguard, an organization that supposedly prioritized maritime security and infrastructure safety. That afternoon, I was standing on the trembling deck of Titan 7, a massive offshore oil transfer station situated in the unforgiving heart of the Gulf of Mexico. It was the absolute peak of hurricane season, and we had stayed too long. The sky above us was a bruised, violently churning mass of black and purple clouds, and the wind was already screaming at over 90 miles an hour. I was in the middle of assessing the structural integrity of the main derrick when the deafening explosive crack of snapping steel ripped through the roar of the storm. A towering crane battered by the relentless gale had just lost its primary securing cables. Time seemed to fracture into slow motion. I barely had a fraction of a second to turn before the sheer force of the collapsing secondary rig threw me violently across the grated steel floor. The impact was a blinding flash of pure, unadulterated agony. I heard the sickening crunch of two ribs snapping instantly upon contact with the deck. Before I could even attempt to drag a breath of air into my burning lungs, a heavy metal bar crashed down from above, pinning my left leg directly against the very edge of the lower deck. The pain was absolute, a white-hot spike driving straight through my nervous system. I tasted warm copper in my mouth. I shoved at the beam with both hands, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Below me, the ocean was a boiling cauldron of black freezing water, and the first massive swells were already violently washing over the edge of the platform, drenching me in freezing foam. Panic erupted on the levels above. Through the torrential rain, I could clearly see the frantic silhouettes of the engineering crew scrambling up the narrow stairwells toward the emergency evacuation helipad. My radio crackled to life, distorted by the static of the storm blaring the immediate mandatory order to abandon the station. Above the howl of the wind, the heavy chopping of the rescue helicopter blades signaled that they were leaving. I screamed for help, but the hurricane ripped the sound right out of my throat before it could travel even 3 feet. The icy water surged up again, completely submerging my pinned leg, dragging at my heavy safety clothing with a terrifying, relentless pull. Then I saw him. While every single person on that rig was stampeding upward in a desperate blind bid for survival, Major Elias Vance was moving in the exact opposite direction. He was the Marine escort assigned to our government inspection team, a man who had spent the last 2 days observing our operations in complete intimidating silence. Now he was descending straight into the chaos. He completely bypassed the crowded main stairwell, hooked a thick tactical line to a steady upper railing, and rappelled straight down the side of the violently vibrating rig into the rising floodwaters. He hit the submerged deck right beside me, the water already crashing up to his thighs. His face was a mask of absolute stone-cold focus. The hurricane was throwing sheets of seawater at us with the force of a pressure washer, but Elias did not hesitate for a microsecond. He drew a heavily serrated tactical knife from his vest and violently hacked away the heavy safety harness and the tangled debris that was trapping my upper body. His hands were incredibly steady despite the freezing rain. With a brutal synchronized heave, he shoved the metal bar just enough for me to yank my bleeding leg free. A fresh blinding wave of agony hit me, almost making my vision go completely black. Elias did not give me the luxury of passing out. He grabbed the shoulder straps of my tactical vest, hauled my broken body upward, and smoothly hoisted me onto his broad back. "Hold on tight," he commanded over the deafening roar of the storm. He began the impossible climb up the narrow, violently shaking steel catwalk. The wind whipped at us mercilessly, threatening to tear us right off the wet metal grating and toss us into the black abyss below. Every single step he took jarred my broken ribs, sending agonizing shockwaves deep into my chest. My blood was mixing with the freezing rain, soaking heavily into the dark collar of his tactical jacket. The sheer terror of the drop below us, combined with the searing physical pain, threatened to completely shatter my mind. I needed an anchor. I needed something, anything, to pull my brain away from the reality that we were seconds away from dying in the middle of the ocean. I pressed my face hard against the side of his neck, struggling to draw a ragged breath through the pain. "Whoever marries you will be lucky." I choked out a desperate, bloody joke meant to mask the fact that I was absolutely terrified. Elias did not break his rapid stride. He did not laugh. As another violent gust of wind shrieked past us, he turned his head just slightly, his voice incredibly calm, deep and clear, right next to my ear. "I was hoping it would be you." That single sentence hit me harder than the collapsing crane. It completely shattered every psychological defense mechanism I had spent years building after my disastrous divorce. For a split second, the howling storm, the blinding pain, and the terror simply ceased to exist. I stared at the side of his face, entirely paralyzed by the raw, unvarnished weight of his words. We reached the upper deck just in time. Elias threw his entire weight against the heavy steel blast door of the inner airlock. We tumbled inside, hitting the solid dry floor, just as a deafening, catastrophic roar echoed from the outside. We watched in stunned silence through the reinforced safety glass as a monstrous, towering wall of black ocean water slammed into the rig. It completely tore away the entire section of the outer walkway we had been standing on just 1 second prior, swallowing thousands of tons of steel into the freezing dark depths. The medical bay at the Global Maritime Vanguard headquarters in Texas smelled of clinical antiseptic and stale corporate coffee. I was confined to a standard-issue wheelchair, my chest tightly bound to stabilize my fractured ribs, every breath a sharp reminder of the ocean's fury. But the physical agony was rapidly being eclipsed by a creeping, suffocating chill that had nothing to do with the storm. I was supposed to be a survivor. Instead, as I was wheeled through the main administrative corridors, I noticed the younger analysts and junior inspectors actively averting their eyes. Conversations abruptly stopped the moment I entered a room. Whispers trailed in my wake like toxic exhaust. I was not a hero who had narrowly escaped a watery grave. I was being treated like a ghost, a walking liability that everyone desperately wanted to avoid. Marcus Thorne, the regional chief executive officer of the organization, walked into my recovery room later that afternoon with the smooth, practiced grace of a seasoned predator. His tailored suit did not have a single crease. His smile was a masterpiece of corporate empathy, perfectly calibrated to convey deep concern, while his eyes remained entirely dead and calculating. He pulled up a chair next to my bed, folding his perfectly manicured hands over his knee. "Natalia, we are all just so incredibly thankful that you made it back to us," he began, his voice dripping with honeyed poison. "It was a terrible, tragic accident out there on the water. But I have to ask you this, purely out of concern for your well-being. Have you been sleeping well lately? I know the divorce last year was incredibly hard on you. The late nights, the stress, the prescription medications you have been taking. It is completely understandable if your mind was fractured. If you were perhaps too distracted to properly evaluate the primary tension lines on that crane." My blood turned to absolute ice. He was doing it right to my face. This was the classic textbook assassination of a professional woman's credibility. He was not asking a genuine question. He was meticulously planting a narrative. He was explicitly painting me as the unstable, hysterical, divorced woman who was too emotionally fragile to do her highly technical job. "My mind was perfectly clear, Marcus," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady, despite the agonizing pain radiating through my chest. "I logged a critical structural warning regarding those specific securing cables exactly 1 week ago." Thorne gave a slow, pitying sigh, reaching out to patronizingly pat my blanket. "I am sure you truly believe you did, Natalia. Just get some rest now. We will handle all the heavy paperwork." The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, I threw the blanket off and dragged myself out of the bed. Ignoring the screaming protest of my broken bones, I booted up the secure medical terminal in the corner of the room and used my senior administrator credentials to access the central engineering database. My hands shook violently as I searched for my filed reports. I hit enter. Nothing. The comprehensive risk assessment I had uploaded last Tuesday had vanished completely from the server. In its place sat a flawlessly formatted safety approval document dated 48 hours before the rig collapsed. It declared the entire structure completely secure. At the bottom of the final page rested my personal encrypted electronic signature. I needed my physical backup drive immediately. I shoved myself back into the wheelchair and navigated the empty back hallways toward the secure employee locker room. I keyed my private access code into locker number 412. The metal door swung open. The heavy-duty external hard drive containing my encrypted daily logs was entirely gone. I looked up at the corner of the ceiling. The red light on the security camera was entirely unlit. A small, freshly printed paper sign taped to the wall read that the surveillance system for this specific quadrant was currently down for routine maintenance. The trap had closed perfectly around me. Later that evening, a night nurse wheeled me down to the underground parking garage for some fresh air. The moment she stepped away to answer her vibrating phone, a dark figure detached itself from the shadows of a massive concrete pillar. It was Elias. He wore dark plain clothes, now blending seamlessly into the gloom of the garage. He crouched right beside my chair, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. "You are being set up to take the fall for the entire disaster," Elias stated bluntly, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the dark perimeter. "I tapped into their executive communication relays this afternoon. Thorne is quietly assembling a federal disciplinary board as we speak. He intends to blame the structural failure on the gross negligence of a mentally unstable employee. It is a smokescreen, Natalia. They are not just trying to fire you. They are trying to bury you alive in order to hide $50 million that was systematically embezzled from the offshore maintenance fund over the past 2 years. My breath hitched painfully. $50 million. It was a staggering sum of money that people would effortlessly kill to protect. I nodded, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles a minute as Elias slipped back into the shadows just before the nurse returned. When I was finally wheeled back to my hospital room, the true horror of my situation finally crystallized. Resting perfectly dead center on my pillow was a small, unmarked manila envelope. There was no return address. There was no postage stamp. It had been hand-delivered by someone with the security clearance to enter the medical wing unnoticed. My hands trembled slightly as I ripped the thick paper open. A single silver USB drive slid out onto the white bed sheets. I plugged it into my tablet. A video file immediately began to play. The footage was grainy but unmistakably clear. It was a hidden camera recording from inside my own apartment living room, taken exactly 3 months ago. It showed me sitting completely alone on my couch in the dark, crying silently, as I swallowed my prescribed anti-anxiety medication with a large glass of red wine. A stark white text document attached to the video file contained exactly one sentence. "Take the early retirement money or rot in federal prison." The sterile silence of the recovery room was broken only by the rhythmic, monotonous hum of my heart monitor. I was exhausted, trapped in a physical body that felt like shattered glass, but my mind was burning with a cold, focused fury. Elias did not leave my side for a single second. He completely ignored the visiting hours posted on the door. He did not offer empty platitudes, and he absolutely refused to look at me with pity. He knew exactly what it felt like to be shoved to the very edge of the abyss. Instead of bringing me useless flowers or greeting cards, he brought me scalding hot bitter black coffee in cheap styrofoam cups and a heavy stack of encrypted digital tablets. He pulled up the uncomfortable plastic visitor chair directly next to my bed and began methodically breaking down the massive cybersecurity vulnerabilities within the internal network of the organization. It was past 2 a.m. when the heavy defensive walls we had both spent years building finally began to crumble. The hospital ward outside my door was completely silent. I watched Elias stare out the dark rain-slicked window, his square jaw clenched tight. Without prompting in a voice entirely stripped of emotion, he told me about a rainy highway exactly 7 years ago. He spoke of the terrifying screech of twisting metal and the crushing, suffocating guilt of surviving a violent car crash that his wife did not. He described the exact agonizing feeling of tearing his bare hands apart, trying to pry open a crushed door, only to realize he was just seconds too late. The flat, clinical way he delivered the story made the raw devastation of his loss hit me even harder. In return, I poured out the toxic, suffocating exhaustion that had been quietly eating away at my soul for the past decade. I told him about the subtle daily humiliations of being a woman in the brutal maritime engineering field who had crossed the age of 35. I described the deep, bone-aching exhaustion of constantly having to prove my technical competence to older men who looked at me and only saw an expiring shelf life compounded by the heavy baggage of a very messy public divorce. As I spoke, I watched his dark eyes intently. He did not look at me the way my ex-husband did, or the way the corporate executives did. He did not see a broken, hysterical woman who needed to be managed, medicated, or fixed. Elias looked at me the exact way a veteran combat soldier looks at a trusted comrade in the trenches. He saw a highly capable, lethal warrior who had simply been temporarily disarmed. That single silent look forged a bond between us that was infinitely stronger than steel. We decided right then and there that we were not going to sit in the dark and wait for the corporate executioner to arrive. We were going to go on the offensive. Elias booted up his classified military terminal, completely bypassing the civilian firewalls, by utilizing his secure satellite access. We began a painstaking, highly methodical sweep of the hidden data transmissions flowing in and out of the executive suite occupied by Marcus. We needed to find the exact origin point of the blackmail video that had been dropped onto my hospital bed. For 3 straight hours, we chased encrypted ghost signals through a dense labyrinth of international proxy servers. Finally, Elias managed to isolate the specific Internet Protocol address embedded deep within the source code of the flash drive. He ran the digits against the master employee registry of the company. I leaned forward, ignoring the sharp, breathless stab of my healing ribs, fully expecting to see the smug face of Marcus staring back at me from the glowing screen. Instead, the secure personnel file that popped up belonged to a 24-year-old woman. It was Chloe, the intensely quiet, seemingly devoted junior assistant who shadowed our chief executive everywhere he went. Elias immediately reached for his tactical phone to run a full federal background check on her, but I quickly placed my hand over his. I stared closely at the digital footprint blinking on the screen. It was too clean. It was too perfectly linear. No, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Do not trace her any further. It is a breadcrumb. I had worked in the exact same office building as Chloe for over 2 years. She was timid, desperately eager to please, and terrified of losing her lucrative corporate job. If she was truly the mastermind trying to destroy me, she would have never left a glaringly obvious digital trail leading directly back to her own personal workstation. I knew exactly how Marcus operated. He was holding something massive and terrible over her head, actively using her as a human shield to do his dirty work. But Chloe was smart. She was terrified, but she was intentionally leaving the back door unlocked for me to find her. She wanted me to follow the trail. She was quietly handing me the exact ammunition I needed to blow this entire $50 million conspiracy wide open. Elias and I sat in the dim blue light of the medical monitors and mapped out a terrifying, incredibly risky counteroffensive. We were not going to run away from the impending federal disciplinary board. We were going to walk straight into the very center of the trap Marcus had meticulously built, and we were going to bring the entire corrupt empire crashing down directly onto his head. Exactly 48 hours later, the agonizing tension broke not with a whisper, but with a highly orchestrated public spectacle. Marcus Thorne convened a mandatory emergency administrative hearing inside the grand glass pavilion of the regional headquarters. The architecture of the room was entirely transparent, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows specifically designed to project an image of pristine corporate honesty to the outside world. Inside, however, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. The industrial air conditioning system was working in absolute overdrive, humming loudly above us, yet I could physically feel the cold sweat gathering heavily on the back of my neck. I was positioned dead center in the front row, trapped entirely within the confines of my medical wheelchair, my broken ribs tightly bound. Behind me sat nearly 80 of my colleagues. These were the engineers, safety inspectors, and administrative staff I had worked alongside for years, people whose lives I had fiercely protected. Seated imposingly at the raised mahogany table at the very front of the room were 3 stern-faced federal investigators. They had just flown in directly from Washington, brought here by Marcus, under the explicit guise of total organizational transparency regarding the offshore disaster. Marcus took his place at the central podium. He looked immaculate, adjusting the sleek microphone with the practiced somber gravity of a seasoned politician who was about to deliver a national eulogy. He did not look at me. Instead, he locked his intensely sincere gaze directly onto the federal agents. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here this morning to address a catastrophic failure of duty," Marcus began, his deep voice echoing loudly through the silent glass-walled room. "We lost millions of dollars in critical infrastructure, and far more importantly, we very nearly lost human lives. As your chief executive, I demanded an immediate, completely uncompromising internal audit to find the absolute root cause of this tragedy. What our security team uncovered is not just a tragic oversight. It is a profound, sickening betrayal of public trust." With a sharp, dramatic click of a wireless remote control, the massive digital projector screen behind him flared to life. He presented a perfectly constructed, utterly flawless dossier of forged evidence. He slowly walked the captive audience through a highly detailed, completely fabricated narrative. He claimed with absolute conviction that I had intentionally bypassed the mandatory, highly rigorous stress tests on the primary offshore crane cables. He painted a vivid, damning picture stating that I had accepted a massive under-the-table payoff from a blacklisted, notoriously substandard steel contractor in exchange for falsifying the structural integrity reports. The sheer audacity of his perfectly delivered lies made my broken ribs throb with a fresh wave of agony. It was an absolute masterclass in corporate assassination. But Marcus was not finished. He needed to drive the final definitive nail into my coffin to ensure I never saw the light of day again. "We tracked the digital paper trail," Marcus continued, his voice deliberately, dropping an octave to convey a sense of deep, sorrowful disappointment. "And the financial evidence is completely undeniable." Another sharp click. The massive screen instantly shifted to display a high-resolution screenshot of an offshore banking ledger. The banking institution was located in the Cayman Islands. The account name printed clearly at the top of the document in bold black letters was Natalia Gonzalez. Directly beside my name was a confirmed stamped deposit receipt for exactly $300,000. The digital timestamp on the wire transfer matched the exact date and the exact hour that my forged electronic signature had allegedly approved the faulty support cables. A collective, highly audible gasp ripped through the crowded room. The absolute heavy silence that followed was terrifying and completely suffocating. It was the exact moment the brutal reality of the herd mentality took over. The very same colleagues who had shared late-night coffee with me, who had trusted my rigorous safety protocols with their own lives, instantly turned into a hostile mob. I could feel the intense physical weight of 80 pairs of eyes boring directly into the back of my skull, dripping with absolute contempt and sheer disgust. The whispers started instantly sharp and venomous, cutting violently through the sterile air of the pavilion. "And here I thought she was one of us," a senior deck supervisor muttered to the woman sitting next to him, his harsh voice carrying clearly over the ambient hum of the room. "Turns out she sold our lives for cheap." "Absolutely disgusting," another familiar voice chimed in from the third row. "No wonder she survived the collapse. She probably knew the rig was going to come down the entire time." The raw, unfiltered hatred in their voices was paralyzing. I was being completely stripped bare, humiliated, and isolated in front of the very people I had bled to protect. It was a visceral, highly public execution designed to break my spirit entirely. Marcus let the collective outrage simmer for exactly the right amount of time before he slowly raised a single hand to silence the room. He turned his head and nodded to the chief of corporate security, standing rigidly near the main exit. "Under the strict federal statutes governing maritime security, I am officially ordering the immediate revocation of her top-level security clearance," Marcus declared, pointing a stiff accusatory finger directly at me. "Strip her badge. Furthermore, I am formally petitioning the federal agents present in this room to initiate an immediate on-the-spot arrest for criminal negligence, wire fraud, and corporate espionage." Two heavily armed corporate security officers immediately stepped forward and began to march down the center aisle toward my wheelchair. Every single muscle in my battered body screamed in protest, urging me to fight, to yell, to defend myself. Instead, I sat perfectly still. I locked my jaw so tight my teeth ground together painfully. I dug my fingernails so deeply into the padded leather armrests of the wheelchair that I finally felt the warm slide of my own blood pooling under my fingertips. I let Marcus bask completely in the glowing spotlight of his own righteous, flawless performance. I let him genuinely believe he had completely crushed me. I did not look at the approaching security guards. I did not look at the glaring screen. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the dark-shadowed corner of the back row, waiting for the single subtle nod from the man standing quietly in the dark. The two corporate security officers were mere inches away, the heavy metal of their handcuffs glinting sharply under the harsh fluorescent lights of the pavilion. I could practically hear the cold clink of the locking mechanism preparing to engage. But before a single steel ring could touch my wrists, a commanding voice completely shattered the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the room. "Stand down immediately," Elias ordered. His tone lacked any excessive volume, yet it carried the absolute undeniable authority of a commanding officer stepping into a chaotic war zone. He strode rapidly down the center aisle, moving with the lethal, unhurried grace of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. He completely bypassed the hesitating security guards and stepped directly onto the raised central podium, his sheer physical presence forcing Marcus to take an involuntary step backward. Elias reached inside his tactical jacket and produced a heavy encrypted set of military credentials, slamming them down onto the polished mahogany table directly in front of the stunned federal investigators from Washington. "As the independent military liaison assigned to oversee this maritime disaster, I am formally invoking Section 4 of the Critical Infrastructure Security Act," Elias declared, his voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. "As of this exact second, this entire facility is under immediate federal lockdown. Nobody enters this room and absolutely nobody leaves." Before Marcus could even open his mouth to protest the sudden aggressive usurpation of his corporate authority, Elias pulled a small matte black military decryption drive from his pocket. He shoved it brutally into the primary input port of the central presentation system. The massive digital projector screen flickered wildly for a fraction of a second before the forged bank statement completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a dense, rapidly scrolling wall of green command code. "I request the lead federal cyber technician in this room to step forward," Elias instructed, gesturing sharply toward the bewildered investigative team. "Trace the exact media access control address, the physical hardware fingerprint of the device that actually authorized the $300,000 wire transfer to the fake Cayman account." The lead technician scrambled to his keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys. The entire room held its collective breath. The heavy, oppressive silence was broken only by the frantic clicking of the keyboard. Seconds ticked by like agonizing hours. Then a single isolated string of alphanumeric characters locked firmly onto the center of the giant screen. "Cross-reference that physical hardware address with the executive asset registry of this company," Elias commanded, his dark eyes locking entirely onto Marcus. The technician typed furiously once again. A new highly classified registration document flashed onto the screen. It was not a workstation assignment for my desk. It was not even a device located within the headquarters. The official registration document displayed a highly customized, extremely expensive satellite wireless router. The registered location of that specific router was a luxury private yacht named the Silver Dividend. The registered owner of that yacht was Marcus Thorne. The collective gasp that erupted from the audience of 80 employees was deafening. The vicious herd mentality that had sought to tear me apart just minutes ago completely stalled, suddenly completely unsure of who the actual bleeding prey was. I did not waste a single microsecond of the shifting momentum. With my jaw clenched tight enough to crack my own teeth, I planted my good leg firmly on the floor and pushed my entire body weight upward, forcing myself out of the wheelchair. The broken ribs in my chest screamed an agonizing white-hot protest, sending brutal spikes of pain straight through my lungs. I ignored the blinding agony and forced my spine completely straight. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket, tapped a single button, and held the speaker directly up to the microphone resting on the defense table. A crystal-clear, entirely unedited audio recording blasted through the surround sound speakers of the glass pavilion. It was Marcus. His voice was completely stripped of its polished, empathetic corporate veneer, sounding vicious, rushed, and incredibly ruthless. "Chloe, listen to me very carefully. You are going to access the Cayman portal right now. Set up a dummy shell account under the Gonzalez woman's name and wire the $300,000. Then get into the central engineering server and scrub her damn cable fault report from last Tuesday completely out of existence. If anyone from the federal board asks, she was drunk on pills and simply missed the inspection." The color completely drained from the face of the chief executive. The immaculately composed predator was instantly gone, violently replaced by a desperate, sweating, cornered animal. Marcus wildly slammed his fist onto the podium, spit flying from his lips. "This is an absolute outrage," he screamed, a thick purple vein bulging visibly on his forehead. "That audio is completely fabricated. It is a deep fake generated by artificial intelligence. You are actually going to listen to a bitter, mentally unstable woman whose own husband could not even stand her. She is a psychotic, washed-up failure trying to take me down with her." He spun frantically toward the security guards. "I gave you a direct order. Throw this crazy bitch out of my building immediately." The heavily armed guards hesitated, thoroughly paralyzed by the rapidly disintegrating power dynamics. But the final lethal blow of the morning did not come from me, and it did not come from Elias. The heavy side door of the pavilion clicked open. Chloe, the intensely quiet junior assistant who had shadowed Marcus like a silent ghost for years, stepped out from the dark wings. She walked directly past her screaming boss, entirely ignoring his sudden terrified silence. She approached the raised table where the 3 federal investigators sat, completely frozen in shock. Chloe reached into her leather bag and pulled out a thick protective plastic sleeve. Inside was the original unedited kickback contract from the blacklisted steel supplier. She slapped it violently onto the mahogany table, the loud smack echoing like a gunshot. "There is his genuine signature in blue ink," Chloe stated, her voice shaking violently but completely resolute. "And right next to it is his actual thumbprint pressed directly into the paper. He took $50 million and he deliberately let that rig collapse. A dead, absolute, suffocating silence slammed down over the entire glass hall. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely and utterly crushed him. The lead federal investigator stood up, the sharp scrape of his wooden chair violently slicing through the dead silence. He did not ask a single question. He simply reached to his tactical belt and unclipped his heavy steel cuffs, the cold. Metallic ratcheting sound echoed sharply across the expansive glass pavilion as the agents locked Marcus Thorne's wrists together right at the central speaker's podium, completely in front of nearly 100 thoroughly stunned employees. The two agents flanked the former chief executive, marching him aggressively down the center aisle. As they passed my wheelchair, Thorne dug his expensive leather heels into the floor for a fraction of a second, leaning down toward me to growl a string of vicious, desperate curses. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I stared straight into his panicked, bloodshot eyes, my voice as cold as the freezing ocean that had almost swallowed me alive. Next time you want to play the corporate corruption game, do not choose a woman who has already lost everything to be your human shield. I told him, enunciating every single word clearly. We do not know how to be afraid. Exactly 6 months passed. The Maritime Organization underwent a massive, sweeping federal purge. My name and my professional record were entirely cleared. I was officially promoted to the position of Senior Safety Advisor and relocated to a quiet, climate-controlled executive office in Virginia. There were no more grueling days wading through freezing mud and climbing rusted, dangerous oil rigs. For the first time in over 10 years, my battered body was finally allowed to truly rest, heal, and breathe. As for Elias and me, we completely bypassed the cinematic, perfectly romantic movie scripts. Our connection was incredibly real, grounded, and thoroughly unglamorous. Elias officially retired from active military duty and moved his entire life to Virginia. The very first time he came over to visit my new apartment, he did not bring a delicate bouquet of red roses. He walked through my front door carrying a heavy steel plumbing toolkit and 2 foil-wrapped beef burritos he had purchased at a corner gas station. We spent that entire Saturday evening arguing loudly and passionately over how to properly read the infuriating assembly blueprints for a cheap wooden cabinet. We laid all our personal flaws completely bare on the living room floor. There was genuine grumpiness, terrible stubbornness, and the highly audible popping of bones, and joints from 2 people pushing 40 every single time we had to bend down to pick up a dropped metal screw or a tiny wooden dowel. By midnight, we were sitting flat on the carpet, resting our tired backs against the slightly crooked, completely finished piece of furniture. Elias reached over his large, calloused hand gently and warmly, rubbing the side of my chest where my ribs had once been shattered. I looked at him in the dim, quiet light of the room, realizing a profound truth. The absolute best kind of love you can find in your adult years is not a fairy tale knight who promises to miraculously shield you from every single storm. It is simply a person who is perfectly willing to sit right next to you in the absolute middle of a messy room, smile through the exhaustion, and say, "Tomorrow we keep fighting." Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from today, so please leave a comment and let me know. If you found today's story engaging and worthwhile, please consider helping our channel with just a $1 donation. You can simply scan the PayPal quick response code right on your screen or use the direct link provided in the description box and the pinned comment below. Your generous support is the only way our hardworking team can pay their rent, feed their families, and keep writing these incredible stories just for you. Thank you again. Stay safe and take care.